Margaret Collins sat in her worn kitchen chair, the morning light filtering through curtains that had seen better days, much like everything else in her modest apartment. At 58, she had the kind of tiredness that sleep couldn't cure, the exhaustion that comes from years of putting everyone else's needs before your own. Her laptop hummed quietly on the scratched wooden table, surrounded by the detritus of a life lived paycheck to paycheck, generic brand coffee, a stack of bills held down by a chipped mug, and a calculator she'd been using to figure out how to stretch her widow's pension another month. She was scrolling through Instagram, something she'd started doing religiously ever since Jake and Isabella had become influencers. It was her way of staying connected to her son's life, even if that life seemed increasingly foreign to her. She watched their stories obsessively, Jake with his perfectly styled hair and designer sneakers, Isabella with her ring lights and carefully curated aesthetic. They were always promoting something, always living their best life, always just out of reach of the modest world Margaret inhabited. But this morning was different. This morning, the first post that appeared on her feed made her heart stop. The photo was stunning, professionally shot with the kind of lighting and composition that screamed expensive wedding photographer. Jake stood in a midnight blue tuxedo that Margaret knew cost more than her monthly pension, his arm around Isabella, who looked like a princess in a gown that probably cost more than Margaret's car. They were kissing beneath an archway of white roses and baby's breath, with the ocean stretching endlessly behind them. The caption made Margaret's hands tremble. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, two successful entrepreneurs celebrating our love story with our chosen family. So grateful for everyone who supported our journey to this moment. Power couple. Self-made. Living our best life. Blessed, just entrepreneur life. Margaret scrolled through the carousel of photos with growing disbelief. There was Jake feeding Isabella cake, both of them laughing with the kind of carefree joy that comes from not having a single financial worry. There was Isabella throwing her bouquet to a crowd of perfectly dressed young women. There were candid shots of the reception, crystal glasses, gold chargers, a band instead of a DJ, centerpieces that probably cost more than Margaret spent on groceries in 3 months. Every photo told the same story. This was the wedding of two successful young people who had made it on their own. The hashtags reinforced the narrative: our self-made, our hustle, our grind pays off, our power couple. In every image, Jake and Isabella glowed with the confidence of people who had never known real financial struggle. Margaret's coffee grew cold as she scrolled and scrolled, looking for any sign of herself in the photos. Surely there would be at least one picture of her with Jake, one mention of his mother in the captions. But there was nothing. She wasn't just absent from the photos. It was as if she had been deliberately erased from the narrative entirely. She clicked on Isabella's profile, her heart pounding. Isabella's post was even more elaborate, with a longer caption about grateful hearts and authentic love, and building an empire together. The comments section was flooded with congratulations from other influencers, business contacts, and friends Margaret had never heard of. Goals F, you two are proof that hard work pays off, wrote someone named Oh Boss Lady Life. This is what happens when two CEOs fall in love, commented a digital nomad babe. Self-made millionaires living the dream. Inspiration. Added Motivation Guru 23. Margaret felt sick. Self-made? Millionaires? Hard work? These people had no idea that every single thing in those photos, the gown, the tuxedo, the venue, the photographer, probably even the engagement ring, had been paid for with money that came from her modest savings account. For 3 years, Margaret had been funding Jake and Isabella's lifestyle. It started small when Jake graduated from college and couldn't find work in his field. Just temporary, Mom, he'd said. Just until I get my business off the ground. The business was a vague concept involving social media and digital marketing, but Margaret didn't understand those things well, enough to ask detailed questions. She just knew her son needed help, and she had a little money saved from the life insurance policy after her husband died. First, it was rent for their downtown apartment, $2,800 a month for a place that was necessary for their image. Then it was a car payment for Isabella's white BMW because image is everything in the influencer space, Margaret. You have to look successful, to be successful. Then it was equipment: cameras, lighting, editing software, a new laptop, a professional tripod. Investment in the future, Jake called it. Somewhere along the way, temporary became permanent, and Margaret found herself paying for everything from their grocery bills to Isabella's monthly hair and nail appointments. Jake would call with emergencies. They needed new outfits for a brand collaboration. Isabella needed professional photos for her portfolio. They had an opportunity to attend a networking event, but needed funds for tickets and hotel. Margaret had sacrificed everything to maintain their lifestyle. She moved from her comfortable 2-bedroom apartment to a studio. She sold her car and relied on public transportation. She stopped eating out, stopped buying new clothes, stopped doing any of the small things that had brought her joy. Her world had shrunk to the size of her paycheck and how much of it she could funnel to Jake and Isabella. And now, scrolling through their wedding photos, she realized the depth of their deception. Not only had they hidden the wedding from her, they had spent the last 3 years crafting an elaborate fiction about their success for their social media followers. While she ate generic brand cereal for dinner to afford their rent, they were posting about building their empire and living the dream. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Isabella. "Hey, Margaret. Hope you saw our amazing news on Instagram. We're so happy and can't wait to celebrate with family soon. Speaking of celebrating, Jake and I have the most incredible opportunity for our honeymoon. We've been invited to the Maldives for a collaboration with a luxury resort, but we need to cover some of the expenses up front. It's going to be huge for our brand. We're talking about content that could reach millions. Could you help us with maybe $15,000? We'll pay you back as soon as the collaboration money comes in. This could really launch us to the next level. Love you." Margaret stared at the message, her hands shaking. $15,000 for a honeymoon to a wedding she hadn't even been invited to. She looked around her tiny apartment, at the peeling linoleum in her kitchen, the second-hand furniture, the stack of past-due notices she'd been avoiding. She thought about the $73 in her checking account, the credit cards she'd maxed out to pay for their essential expenses, the retirement savings she'd already depleted. Then she looked back at the Instagram posts, at her son and daughter-in-law glowing with happiness and success, at the hundreds of comments from strangers praising them for their hard work and self-made success. For the first time in 3 years, something inside Margaret began to crack. It wasn't sadness. She'd been sad for so long that the emotion had worn smooth. It wasn't even hurt, though the betrayal cut deep. It was something else, something she hadn't felt in years. It was anger. Margaret closed Instagram and opened her banking app. She scrolled through 3 years of transaction history, adding up every payment she'd made on their behalf. Rent, $800 car. Payment, $2,800 insurance. 7i200s credit card payments, 30-4500s equipment, $12,000. Clothes, $18,000. Events, $8,500. Emergency funds, $23,000. Miscellaneous. Expenses, $41,200. The total made her gasp, $274,000. Over $250,000. Her entire life savings, her husband's life insurance, her mother's small inheritance, and more debt than she'd ever imagined she could accumulate. She had made them rich while she had become poor. She had funded their success while her own life had diminished to almost nothing. And they had repaid her by erasing her from their greatest celebration, by presenting themselves to the world as self-made successes while she struggled to pay for generic groceries. Margaret looked at Isabella's text message again. The casual entitlement of it, the assumption that she would continue to fund their lifestyle no matter how badly they treated her, made something inside her snap. She was done being invisible. She was done being used. She was done sacrificing her life for people who couldn't even be bothered to invite her to their wedding. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret Collins was going to put herself first. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling of her studio apartment, her mind churning with a mixture of rage, betrayal, and something else, a clarity she hadn't felt in years. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those wedding photos, the perfectly curated images of success built on her sacrifice. The next morning, she did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She turned off her phone and didn't check Jake's messages. Instead, she made herself a proper breakfast, real eggs instead of the instant oatmeal she'd been surviving on, and sat down with a notebook and calculator. She began documenting everything. Every bank transfer, every credit card charge, every loan she'd taken out to keep them afloat. The numbers told a devastating story of systematic exploitation disguised as family obligation. While she had been cutting back on everything, shopping at discount stores, skipping meals, avoiding medical appointments she couldn't afford, they had been living like celebrities. By noon, Margaret had filled 12 pages with itemized expenses. The car alone had cost her $28,800 in payments, plus insurance, plus maintenance. The apartment rent had consumed over $100,000 of her savings. The emergency requests had totaled more than her annual income. And through it all, they had been building a brand based on the lie of self-made success. When she finally turned her phone back on, there were 17 missed calls from Isabella and 6 from Jake. The text messages painted a picture of growing desperation masked as manipulative sweetness. Isabella, 9:15 a.m. Margaret, honey, did you see my text yesterday? We really need to book the Maldives trip ASAP. The resort is holding our spot, but only until tomorrow. Isabella, 10:30 a.m. Getting worried that I haven't heard from you. Is everything okay? Jake is stressed about missing this opportunity. You know how hard we've been working. Jake, 11:45 a.m. Mom, Isabella said you haven't responded about the honeymoon. This is really important for our business. I thought you'd be excited to help us celebrate. Isabella, 12:20 p.m. Margaret, I'm starting to think you're upset about something. If this is about the wedding, I told you we wanted to keep it small and intimate. You understand, right? It was nothing personal. Margaret stared at that last message until the words blurred. Nothing personal. 3 years of funding their lifestyle and being excluded from the most important day of her son's life was nothing personal. She opened her laptop and began typing a response, then deleted it. Started again, deleted again. Finally, she wrote something simple. I need time to think. Please don't contact me for a few days. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Within minutes, her phone was ringing. Jake's photo filled the screen, a professional headshot she'd paid for during one of his networking is everything phases. She declined the call. It rang again immediately. Declined again. The third time, she turned off the phone entirely. For the next 3 days, Margaret experienced something she hadn't felt since before her husband died. Peace. Without the constant anxiety of checking her bank balance to see how much Jake and Isabella needed this time, without the stress of figuring out how to juggle their expenses with her own survival, she could think clearly. She took walks around her neighborhood, something she hadn't done in months. She went to the library and read actual books instead of scrolling through social media to monitor Jake and Isabella's posts. She cooked real meals and ate them slowly, tasting food instead of rushing through sustenance between financial crises. On the 4th day, she turned her phone back on. 53 missed calls. Dozens of text messages that escalated from sweet manipulation to barely contained anger. Day 1, Isabella. Margaret, we're getting really worried about you. Please just let us know you're okay. Day 2, Jake. Mom, this isn't like you. Isabella is crying because she thinks she did something wrong. Just call us back. Day 3, Isabella. Margaret, I don't know what we did to upset you, but please don't punish Jake for my mistakes. He loves you so much, and he's heartbroken that you won't talk to him. Day 3, Jake. Mom, I don't understand what's happening. We missed the Maldives opportunity because we couldn't book it in time. Isabella is devastated. Why are you being so selfish? Day 4, Isabella. Fine. I guess I know where I stand with you. Jake deserves better than this emotional manipulation. We're trying to build a life together and you're sabotaging us out of jealousy. Margaret read through all the messages, watching the progression from fake concern to emotional manipulation to outright hostility. This was who they really were when they couldn't get what they wanted from her. That afternoon, she made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. She called her bank and canceled all automatic transfers to Jake and Isabella's accounts. She canceled the credit card she'd given Jake for emergencies. She removed Isabella as an authorized user on her cards. Then she sat back and waited. She didn't have to wait long. Within hours of the first decline transaction, her phone exploded with calls and messages. But this time, the mask was completely off. Jake. Mom, what the hell? My card got declined at the grocery store. People were staring. Do you know how embarrassing that was? Isabella. Margaret, I hope you're proud of yourself. We can't pay rent because of your little tantrum. Are you trying to make us homeless? Jake. This is insane. You're acting like a crazy person. We're your family. We're just asking for help while we build our business. Isabella. I always knew you were jealous of me, but I never thought you'd try to destroy your own son's future. What kind of mother does that? Margaret turned off her phone again. But this time, instead of feeling guilty or anxious, she felt something unexpected. Relief. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't responsible for their problems. She wasn't scrambling to find money she didn't have for expenses she couldn't afford. The next morning, she woke up and made coffee, real coffee, not the instant kind she'd been buying to save money, and opened her laptop. If Jake and Isabella wanted to play the social media game, she was going to learn the rules. She created an Instagram account, The Real Story Mom. Her first post was simple. A photo of her kitchen table covered with bank statements, receipts, and her notebook of calculations. The caption read, 3 years ago, I started supporting my son and his girlfriend while they built their business. Today, I learned they got married without inviting me. While posting about being self-made entrepreneurs, time to tell the real story. The real story, invisible support, time for truth. Margaret stared at the post for a long time before hitting publish. Once she did, there would be no going back. She would be choosing herself over the people who had been using her, and she knew they wouldn't forgive her for it. But as she thought about the studio apartment she lived in, because she'd sacrificed her comfortable home for their lifestyle, about the generic groceries she ate while they posted pictures of expensive restaurants, about the wedding photos where she didn't exist, Margaret realized she didn't care about their forgiveness anymore. She wanted her life back. She hit publish. Margaret's first Instagram post received 12 likes in the first hour, mostly from her former co-workers and a few neighbors. It wasn't viral by any means, but it was a start. More importantly, it was the truth, and putting it out into the world felt like exhaling after holding her breath for 3 years. She spent the next few days methodically documenting her story. Post by post, she laid out the financial reality behind Jake and Isabella's glamorous lifestyle. She photographed receipts for Isabella's designer handbags, screenshots of Jake's Venmo requests for urgent business expenses that turned out to be restaurant bills, bank statements showing the monthly transfers that had drained her savings. Her follower count grew slowly but steadily. People began sharing her posts with comments like, "This is why I'm worried about social media culture," and "These influencers are out of control." More importantly, other parents started sharing their own stories in the comments, tales of adult children who had weaponized family loyalty to fund unsustainable lifestyles. By the end of the week, Margaret had documented $274,632.18 in expenses she'd covered for Jake and Isabella over 3 years. The number, broken down into clear categories with photographic evidence, painted an undeniable picture of exploitation. But her newfound transparency came at a cost. Jake and Isabella's response was swift and brutal. Jake showed up at her apartment building on a Thursday evening, his face flushed with rage. Margaret saw him from her 4th-floor window, pacing in front of the entrance, gesticulating wildly while talking on his phone. She didn't buzz him up. Her phone rang. She answered on the 4th ring. "Mom, what the hell are you doing?" Jake's voice was strained, almost unrecognizable. "Do you have any idea how this is affecting us?" Isabella's crying, "Our sponsors are asking questions. People are talking about us online." "People are talking about the truth," Margaret said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "Something they should have heard years ago." "Truth? Mom, you're making us look like monsters. We never forced you to help us. You offered. You said you wanted to support our dreams." Margaret closed her eyes, remembering all the times Jake had called with emergencies. The rent that would result in eviction, if not paid immediately. The car that would be repossessed. The once-in-a-lifetime opportunities that required immediate funding. How many of those emergencies had been real? How many had been manufactured to trigger her maternal instincts? Did I offer to pay for a wedding I wasn't invited to? She asked quietly. Jake was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted from anger to the wheedling tone she knew so well. Mom, we wanted to keep it small. It wasn't personal. A destination wedding with 50 guests isn't small, Jake. And excluding your mother from the most important day of your life is absolutely personal. You're being dramatic. Look, just delete the posts, okay? We can talk about this. Maybe we got a little carried away with the independence thing on social media, but you know how it is with our brand. Image matters in our business. Margaret felt that familiar tug, the desire to smooth things over, to make peace, to put his needs before her own dignity. But this time, something held her back. Maybe it was the memory of eating instant oatmeal for dinner while they posted pictures from expensive restaurants. Maybe it was the realization that in 3 years, Jake had never once asked about her well-being, only her bank balance. No, she said simply. No what? No, I won't delete the posts. No, I won't pretend the last 3 years didn't happen. No, I won't keep funding your lifestyle while you erase me from your story. Jake's voice hardened again. Fine, but don't come crying to us when you end up all alone. This is exactly why Dad died young, the stress of dealing with your controlling behavior. The line went dead. Margaret stared at her phone, Jake's words echoing in her mind. It was a cruel thing to say, designed to hit her where it would hurt most. The old Margaret would have been devastated, would have called back immediately to apologize for something that wasn't her fault. Instead, she screenshotted their text conversation and added it to her Instagram story with the caption, "When financial support stops, the emotional manipulation begins." The real war began when Isabella discovered Margaret's Instagram account. Margaret woke up on Saturday morning to find that her story had been shared hundreds of times overnight. Her follower count had jumped from 847 to over 3,000. The comments section was filled with support from other parents who had experienced similar exploitation, mixed with angry messages from Jake and Isabella's followers defending the young entrepreneurs. But the message that made her stomach drop was from Isabella herself. "Two can play this game, Margaret. You want to destroy our reputation? Let's see how you like it when the internet sees what a toxic, manipulative mother you really are. We have screenshots of everything. Every guilt trip, every passive-aggressive text, every time you held money over our heads to control us. Hope it was worth it." Within hours, Jake and Isabella had posted their counterattack. Their posts were masterpieces of manipulation, painting Margaret as an overbearing mother who had insisted on controlling their lives with financial strings attached. They shared carefully edited screenshots of conversations where Margaret's messages about budgets and expenses were presented without context, making her appear miserly and controlling. Isabella's post was particularly devastating. "I'm heartbroken to address this publicly, but I feel I have to defend my husband and our marriage. My mother-in-law has been waging a campaign against us ever since we tried to establish healthy boundaries. When we politely declined her excessive involvement in our wedding planning, she retaliated by cutting off financial support and trying to humiliate us online. This is what financial abuse looks like, using money as a weapon to control adult children. We're sharing our story because we know we're not alone. Financial abuse, toxic family, healthy boundaries." Jake's post was shorter but equally effective. "It breaks my heart to say this, but my mother has been trying to control my life with money for years. When Isabella and I finally stood up for ourselves and set boundaries, she turned vicious. No parent should use financial support as emotional manipulation. We're not perfect, but we deserve to live our own lives without being held hostage by guilt and money. That's your boundaries, emotional abuse, moving forward." The posts went viral in a way that Margaret's careful documentation never had. Jake's had 50,000 likes within 6 hours. Isabella's had been shared over 10,000 times. The comment sections were filled with support for the young couple trying to escape a controlling mother. Margaret watched her carefully constructed narrative crumble in real time. Her own follower count was growing. She now had over 8,000 followers, but the conversation had shifted. She was no longer the exploited mother telling her story. She had become the villain in someone else's tale of liberation. The worst part was how believable their story was. Financial abuse was a real thing, and the way they presented the situation, with carefully cropped screenshots and emotional appeals, made Margaret look like exactly the kind of parent people had horror stories about. Her attempts to document the money she'd spent looked petty and vindictive next to their narrative of seeking independence from an overbearing mother. The harassment began almost immediately. Margaret's Instagram was flooded with comments calling her everything from narcissistic to psychotic. People dug up her address and workplace information. Someone started a Change.org petition demanding that her former employer investigate her for emotional abuse of family members. But the cruelest cut came from an unexpected source. Distant family members who had seen the viral posts and believed Jake and Isabella's version of events. Margaret's sister Linda called on Sunday evening, her voice cold with disapproval. "Margaret, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this social media thing has to stop. Jake called me crying. He said you've been controlling him with money for years, and now you're trying to destroy his marriage because you can't let go. This isn't like you. Linda, you don't understand what really... I understand that you're airing your dirty laundry in public and making our whole family look bad. Whatever problems you have with Jake, this isn't the way to handle it. You're embarrassing yourself." After Linda hung up, Margaret sat in her dark apartment and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe she was being controlling. Maybe she had crossed a line by posting private family business online. Maybe Jake and Isabella were right, and she was just a bitter old woman who couldn't accept that her son had grown up and moved on. But then she looked around her studio apartment, the apartment she lived in because she'd given up her comfortable home to pay their rent. She thought about the generic groceries in her refrigerator, the medical appointments she'd skipped because she couldn't afford the co-pays, the credit card debt that would take her years to pay off. No, she wasn't the villain in this story. She was just someone who had finally decided to stop being invisible. By Monday morning, Margaret realized she was in a war she didn't know how to fight. Jake and Isabella had years of experience crafting online narratives, manipulating emotions, and building audiences. They knew how to make themselves look sympathetic, and her look unhinged. Every time she tried to respond to their accusations with facts and documentation, it only made her appear more obsessive and controlling. She needed help. Margaret's first call was to her old co-worker Sandra, who had been supportive in her Instagram comments from the beginning. Sandra was a social worker who specialized in family dynamics and financial exploitation cases. "Margaret, honey, you're dealing with what we call DARVO," Sandra explained over coffee at a small cafe near Margaret's apartment. Deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. They're denying the exploitation ever happened, attacking your character, and making themselves the victims of your abuse. It's a classic manipulation tactic. But Linda believes them. Other people believe them. Maybe I am being controlling. Maybe I should have just stayed quiet and... Stop. Sandra's voice was firm. I've seen your documentation. 3 years. Nearly $300,000, systematic exploitation, and then exclusion from major life events. That's not support. That's being used as a human ATM. The fact that they can manipulate the narrative doesn't change the facts. Sandra helped Margaret understand that she was dealing with people who were skilled at emotional manipulation and public relations. They're influencers, Margaret. Their entire career is built on making people believe carefully crafted stories. Of course they're good at this. Over the next few days, with Sandra's guidance, Margaret developed a strategy. Instead of trying to fight fire with fire, she would focus on building a community of people who understood what she'd been through. Instead of defending herself against every accusation, she would continue telling her story with facts, documentation, and quiet dignity. Margaret also reached out to other parents who had commented on her posts with similar stories. She started a private Facebook group called Invisible Providers for parents who had been financially exploited by adult children. The group grew slowly but steadily, providing a space for people to share their experiences without public judgment. Through the group, Margaret met Eleanor, a 62-year-old woman whose daughter had convinced her to take out a second mortgage to fund a failed business venture. Eleanor had been dealing with similar online harassment after she'd finally said no to more funding. The hardest part, Eleanor told Margaret during one of their phone calls, is realizing that the people you sacrificed everything for don't actually love you. They love what you provide. Once you stop providing it, you see who they really are. Margaret also took practical steps to protect herself. She changed her phone number and gave the new one only to trusted friends and family. She made her Instagram account private and carefully vetted new follower requests. She blocked Jake and Isabella on all platforms and asked friends and family not to share information about her with them. Most importantly, Margaret started taking care of herself for the first time in years. She found a therapist who specialized in family financial abuse. She joined a grief counseling group. She realized she was mourning not just the loss of her relationship with Jake, but the loss of the person she had thought he was. She also made small changes that felt revolutionary after years of deprivation. She bought herself new clothes, not expensive ones, but clothes that fit properly and made her feel good. She started cooking real meals again. She got her hair cut and colored for the first time in 2 years. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret started planning for her future instead of just surviving each month. She met with a financial advisor to understand the full extent of the damage and create a plan for recovery. The news wasn't good. She would probably never fully recover the money she'd lost. But there was hope for rebuilding. As Margaret prepared for what she suspected would be a long battle, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: purpose. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was fighting back. And whether she won or lost, at least she would be fighting. For herself instead of sacrificing herself for people who didn't value her sacrifice. The war was far from over, but for the first time since it began, Margaret felt like she had a chance of winning. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, when Margaret received a call that made her blood run cold. "Mrs. Collins? This is Detective Sarah Chen with the Fraud Division. We need to speak with you about some financial irregularities that have been reported involving your son, Jake Thompson." Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped the phone. "What kind of irregularities?" "We've received reports that you may be a victim of elder financial abuse. Your son and daughter-in-law have filed a complaint alleging that you've been making false accusations against them online. But in the process of investigating their claims, we discovered some concerning patterns in your financial records. It turned out that Jake and Isabella's attempt to paint themselves as victims had backfired spectacularly. When they contacted authorities to report Margaret for harassment and false accusations, they had provided their own financial records as evidence of their independence. But those records told a different story than their social media presence suggested. The detective explained that Jake and Isabella had been reporting significantly lower income on their tax returns than what their lifestyle suggested. When cross-referenced with Margaret's bank records, it became clear that they had been essentially committing tax fraud by not reporting the money Margaret gave them as income. "The amounts involved are substantial enough that this could be a federal case," Detective Chen explained. "We're talking about potential charges of tax evasion, fraud, and elder financial abuse." Margaret felt dizzy. "I never wanted them to get in legal trouble. I just wanted them to stop lying about where their money came from." "Mrs. Collins, what happened to you is a crime. The fact that they're your family doesn't change that. We'd like you to come in and give a formal statement." But before Margaret could respond to the police investigation, Jake and Isabella launched their most vicious attack yet. That evening, Isabella posted a video that quickly went viral across multiple platforms. She sat in their expensively furnished apartment, tears streaming down her face, with Jake's arm around her shoulders. "I can't stay silent anymore," Isabella began, her voice shaking with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "Margaret Collins, Jake's mother, has been stalking and harassing us for weeks. We tried to handle this privately, but she's escalated to the point where we fear for our safety." The video was a masterpiece of manipulation. Isabella claimed that Margaret had been sending them threatening messages, that she had showed up at their apartment building multiple times, that she had been contacting their friends and business associates to spread lies about them. She showed screenshots of messages that looked threatening, but were clearly taken out of context from longer conversations. "This woman cannot accept that her son is an adult with his own life," Isabella continued. "She's been trying to control Jake with money for years, and when that stopped working, she turned to psychological abuse. We've had to change our phone numbers. we're considering moving, and I'm afraid to leave my apartment alone." Jake then took over the video, his usual confident demeanor replaced with what appeared to be genuine distress. "My mother has serious mental health issues that she's been hiding for years. The financial support she talks about? Half of it was money she insisted on giving us, then used to guilt trip us later. She would threaten to cut us off every time we made decisions she didn't like. Who we spent time with, where we lived, even who I dated before Isabella." The video concluded with Isabella's tearful plea. "We're sharing this because we want other families to recognize the signs of this kind of abuse. Just because someone is your parent doesn't give them the right to control your life with money and then punish you when you try to set boundaries. We're not asking for sympathy, we just want it to stop." Within hours, our justice for Jake and Isabella was trending on Twitter. The video had been shared over 100,000 times across platforms. Influencers and celebrities began weighing in, with most expressing support for the young couple being stalked by an abusive parent. The harassment of Margaret intensified beyond anything she had experienced before. Her address was doxed, and people began showing up at her apartment building to take photos and leave negative reviews of the building online. Her landlord called to say he was concerned about the situation and whether her lease would be renewed. Someone created a fake dating profile using Margaret's photos with the caption, "Crazy cat lady who stalks her own son." The profile was reported and removed, but not before screenshots were shared thousands of times with increasingly cruel commentary about her appearance and presumed mental state. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source. A local news station picked up the story. "Tonight at 11, a social media feud between a mother and son has escalated into allegations of stalking and financial abuse. We'll examine both sides of this viral family drama and ask, when does parental involvement cross the line into harassment?" Margaret watched the news segment with growing horror. The reporter, Linda Martinez, had clearly done minimal research and relied heavily on Jake and Isabella's narrative. The segment included their tearful video, sympathetic interviews with some of their friends, and expert commentary from a family therapist who spoke generally about enmeshed parent-child relationships and financial manipulation as a form of control. Margaret was given less than 30 seconds of the 5-minute segment. The reporter had called her for comment, but Margaret had been so overwhelmed that she'd simply said, "I just wanted them to tell the truth about where their money came from." Taken out of context and delivered in a shaky voice, it made her sound exactly like the unstable, obsessive mother Jake and Isabella had painted her to be. The news segment was the final straw for many people in Margaret's life. Her sister Linda called the next morning, her voice cold with finality. "Margaret, I saw the news. I can't have this kind of chaos associated with our family. Don't contact me or my children until you get professional help and make things right with Jake." Even some members of Margaret's Invisible Providers support group began to distance themselves, worried that associating with her would bring the same kind of harassment into their own lives. Margaret felt more alone than she had since her husband died. Everywhere she looked, people believed Jake and Isabella's version of events. She had been cast as the villain in a story that had millions of viewers, and no amount of documentation or evidence seemed to matter when faced with their skilled emotional manipulation. That night, Margaret sat in her apartment with all the lights off, staring at her phone. The rational part of her mind told her that Detective Chen's investigation would eventually reveal the truth. The financial records were clear, the tax fraud was real, and the pattern of exploitation was well documented. But the emotional part of her mind whispered that maybe everyone was right. Maybe she was obsessive. Maybe she was controlling. Maybe she should just apologize, delete everything, and try to rebuild her relationship with Jake and Isabella on their terms. For the first time since this all began, Margaret seriously considered giving up. But as she sat in the darkness, her phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected source. Eleanor, the woman from her support group, whose daughter had scammed her out of her house. "I know you're probably feeling like the whole world is against you right now. I've been where you are, but I need you to know something. I've been quietly collecting evidence of your story for weeks, and you're not alone. There are more of us than you know, and we're not going to let them destroy you. Check your email in an hour. Don't give up. The truth matters, even when it's not popular. Margaret's email, when she checked it, contained a link to a Google Drive folder with hundreds of files. Eleanor and several other members of the support group had been documenting similar cases, collecting stories from other parents who had been financially exploited by adult children. And most importantly, they had found something Margaret had missed. Jake and Isabella weren't just tax evaders. They were running what amounted to a sophisticated con game targeting multiple victims. The support group had found at least 12 other cases where Jake and Isabella had received significant investments or loans from older adults who had been impressed by their social media success. Several of those people had never been paid back, and some had been told the same stories about business emergencies and once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. More importantly, Eleanor had found evidence that Jake and Isabella's entire lifestyle was funded not just by Margaret, but by a rotating cast of financial supporters who had been carefully manipulated and then discarded when they were no longer useful. Margaret realized that she wasn't just fighting for her own reputation. She was fighting for all the other victims who didn't have the courage or platform to speak up. The next morning, Detective Chen called with an update that changed everything. "Mrs. Collins, we've expanded our investigation based on some tips we received. It appears your son and daughter-in-law may have been running what we call a long con, targeting multiple victims with the same kinds of financial manipulation they used on you. We're going to need your help to build a case, but I want you to know, you're not crazy, you're not obsessive, and you're definitely not alone." For the first time in weeks, Margaret smiled. The battle was far from over, but she finally had what she'd been lacking: proof that she was right, allies who believed her, and the knowledge that her fight was about more than just her own dignity. It was about justice. The tide began to turn when Detective Chen's investigation went public. 2 weeks after Margaret's darkest moment, the local news station that had painted her as an obsessive mother ran a very different story. Social media influencers charged with elder fraud and multi-victim scheme. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of financial exploitation that went far beyond Margaret's case. Jake and Isabella had systematically targeted older adults, many of them parents of friends or distant relatives, who were impressed by their social media success and willing to invest in their business ventures. The scheme was sophisticated and cruel. They would identify potential victims through social media, usually people who commented supportively on their posts or showed interest in their lifestyle. They would then cultivate relationships with these individuals, sharing their financial struggles privately while maintaining their successful public image. Over 3 years, they had collected nearly $800,000 from 18 different victims. Each person believed they were the only one helping the struggling young entrepreneurs. Each had been promised repayment that never came. Each had been manipulated with the same emotional tactics Margaret knew so well: the guilt trips, the emergency situations, the promises that this time would be different. Margaret learned all this during a conference call with Detective Chen and a federal prosecutor named Robert Hayes. "Mrs. Collins, your documentation and your willingness to speak publicly about what happened to you was the key that broke this case open," Prosecutor Hayes explained. "When you started posting about the financial exploitation, it gave other victims the courage to come forward. Without your Instagram posts, we might never have connected all these cases. The charges were serious: wire fraud, tax evasion, and elder financial abuse across state lines, which made it a federal case. Jake and Isabella were arrested on a Tuesday morning, their glamorous lifestyle collapsing as dramatically as it had been built. The arrest was live-streamed by a neighbor, and the video went viral for all the wrong reasons. Jake and Isabella, who had spent years curating an image of success and sophistication, were led away in handcuffs from their expensive apartment wearing pajamas and no makeup. The contrast to their polished social media presence was stark and devastating. Within hours of the arrest, the narrative that had painted Margaret as an obsessive, controlling mother began to crumble. The same influencers and celebrities who had supported Jake and Isabella began quietly deleting their posts. The hashtag #TheJusticeForJake and Isabella disappeared from trending topics. But Margaret's vindication came with its own challenges. The same news outlets that had portrayed her as unstable now wanted interviews about her experience as a victim of financial fraud. Social media accounts that had harassed her began posting apologies and asking for forgiveness. "I don't want to be famous for being a victim," Margaret told Sandra during one of their coffee meetings. "I just want my life back." But Margaret was discovering that she couldn't simply return to the life she'd had before. The woman who had spent 3 years sacrificing everything for people who didn't value her sacrifice no longer existed. In her place was someone who had learned to fight for herself, to value her own dignity, and to recognize manipulation when she saw it. The legal process moved slowly but steadily. Jake and Isabella's assets were frozen, including the expensive apartment, the car, and all the designer goods that had been purchased with their victims' money. They were released on bail, but prohibited from using social media or contacting any of their victims. Margaret attended every hearing, not out of vengeance, but because she had become an advocate for all the victims. Through the Invisible Providers support group, she had connected with other parents who had been financially exploited by adult children. She had also met some of Jake and Isabella's other victims, including a 73-year-old retired teacher named Dorothy who had given them $45,000 for a restaurant investment that never existed. "You saved my life," Dorothy told Margaret after one court hearing. "I was so ashamed about what happened that I wasn't going to tell anyone. But seeing you speak out gave me the courage to report it. I thought I was just a stupid old woman who got fooled." Margaret's Instagram account, The Real Story Mom, had grown to over 50,000 followers. But instead of focusing on her own story, she had transformed it into a resource for financial abuse victims. She shared warning signs of elder financial exploitation, resources for reporting fraud, and most importantly, stories from other survivors who wanted to break the silence around family financial abuse. The account had become something Margaret had never intended, a movement. "Financial abuse thrives in shame and silence," Margaret wrote in one of her most popular posts. "Victims don't speak up because they're embarrassed that someone they loved could treat them so badly. But shame belongs to the abusers, not the victims. The more we talk about this, the harder it becomes for predators to operate." 6 months after the arrest, Jake and Isabella pled guilty to multiple federal charges. They were sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to their victims, though everyone involved knew that most of the money was gone forever. Margaret attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom. When the judge asked if any victims wanted to make a statement, she stood up. "Your Honor, I'm not here to ask for revenge against my son and his wife. I'm here because what they did to me and 17 other people was a crime that destroys families and devastates lives. I want them to serve their time, learn from their mistakes, and hopefully become better people. But more than that, I want their story to serve as a warning to others. Financial predators often target the people who love them most. Parents, grandparents, close friends. We're vulnerable because we want to help. We need to teach people that love doesn't mean accepting financial exploitation, and that saying no to someone you care about isn't cruel. It's necessary." After the hearing, Margaret was approached by a reporter from a national magazine who had been covering financial fraud cases. "Mrs. Collins, would you be interested in writing a book about your experience? There's clearly a need for more awareness about this kind of family financial abuse." Margaret considered the offer. 6 months ago, she would have been horrified at the idea of making her private family business even more public. But she had learned that her story wasn't just about her. It was about every parent who had been manipulated with guilt and love into funding someone else's lies. "I'll think about it," she told the reporter, "but only if it can help other people avoid what I went through." 1 year after discovering Jake's wedding on Instagram, Margaret Collins stood in her new apartment, a bright, comfortable one-bedroom in a building with a garden where she had started growing vegetables. The studio apartment was a memory, along with the generic groceries and the constant financial anxiety. She wasn't wealthy. The restitution from Jake and Isabella's case had covered less than half of what she'd lost. But she was stable. More importantly, she was free from the exhausting cycle of emergency requests and guilt-driven generosity that had defined her life for 3 years. Margaret's book, The Invisible Provider, A Mother's Story of Financial Abuse and Recovery, had been published to positive reviews and strong sales. She donated half the proceeds to organizations that helped elder fraud victims and used the rest to fully pay off the credit card debt she'd accumulated during her years of supporting Jake and Isabella. But the book was just one part of what had become Margaret's new purpose. She now worked part-time as a victim advocate, helping other financial abuse survivors navigate the legal system and rebuild their lives. She spoke at conferences about elder fraud, consulted with law enforcement agencies developing training programs, and continued to run the support groups that had saved her during her darkest moments. Invisible Providers had grown into a national organization with chapters in 12 states. Margaret received emails daily from people who had read her story and recognized their own experiences in it. Parents who had been funding adult children's lifestyles while living in poverty themselves. Grandparents who had been convinced to invest life savings in business opportunities that never materialized. Spouses who had been financially drained by partners who contributed nothing to the household but demanded everything. On this particular morning, Margaret was preparing for a video call with a woman in Oregon whose daughter had convinced her to take out a reverse mortgage to fund a clothing boutique that existed only on social media. It was a story Margaret had heard variations of dozens of times now, but each one still made her heart ache for the victims who blamed themselves for being manipulated by people they loved. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Eleanor, now a close friend and co-founder of Invisible Providers. Saw the news about Jake and Isabella's parole hearing being denied. How are you feeling? Margaret thought about the question as she looked around her apartment. On her bookshelf sat a photo of her and her late husband, next to pictures of the friends she'd made through her advocacy work. Her refrigerator was covered with thank you cards from people she'd helped, graduation announcements from young people in her building who had adopted her as a kind of surrogate grandmother, and a schedule for the community college courses she'd started taking. She realized she hadn't thought about Jake and Isabella's parole hearing until Eleanor mentioned it. A year ago, every development in their case had consumed her thoughts. Now their fate felt like something that was happening to other people, people who had once been important to her, but who had chosen to exclude themselves from her life through their own actions. Margaret texted back, "I'm feeling grateful for the friends who stood by me, for the strangers who became allies, for the chance to turn something painful into something useful. I'm feeling proud of the life I've built without them." As she prepared for her video call with the woman in Oregon, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had changed. She had lost a son and daughter-in-law who had never really valued her anyway, but she had gained a community of people who understood her experience, a purpose that felt meaningful, and most importantly, respect for herself that couldn't be bought or manipulated away. Her last Instagram post had been simple, but powerful. "A year ago, I discovered my son's wedding through social media after being excluded from the celebration I had funded. Today, I'm celebrating something more important, the anniversary of the day I decided to value myself as much as I valued the people who were using me." To anyone reading this who feels invisible, exploited, or taken for granted, you matter. Your dignity matters. Your financial security matters. And you deserve relationships based on love and respect, not guilt and obligation. It's never too late to put yourself first. The post had received over 10,000 likes and hundreds of comments from people sharing their own stories of financial exploitation and recovery. But the comment that meant the most to Margaret came from Dorothy, the retired teacher who had lost $45,000 to Jake and Isabella's restaurant scam. "Margaret, because of your courage to speak up, I got my money back. I learned to recognize manipulation, and I found a community of people who understand what I went through. You didn't just save yourself, you saved all of us. Thank you for showing us that we deserved better." Margaret smiled as she opened her laptop for the video call. She had work to do, more people to help, more stories to hear, more lives to help rebuild from the damage caused by financial predators who weaponized love and family loyalty. It wasn't the life she had planned when she first started supporting Jake and Isabella 3 years ago. It was better. It was a life where she mattered not just for what she could provide, but for who she was and what she had survived. And for the first time in years, Margaret Collins was truly living instead of just surviving.